Hi, I'm Tom Rittman from Appriss Retail, and this is a webinar on Do You Love Returns? A recap of the annual NRF Appriss Retail Consumer Returns in the Industry Report from the year 2020. So if you allow me to share my slides, give me just a moment. So when we did the research on Do You Love Returns and through the NRF Appriss Retail Industry Research, we learned several things. Returns dramatically impact the customer consumer experience. Returns are increasing because of changes in overall shopping behavior, driven in large part by e-commerce during the recent pandemic. Returns cost retailers money because there's money flowing back to the consumer and out of the retail store. They're often difficult to manage because for consumers, they contain both good and bad outcomes. And they can often be frustrating for consumers, leading often to a poor consumer experience within the store or through the website with that retail brand. The analysis that was done with the NRF showed that there was over $4 trillion in sales in the US in 2020. Of that, 10.6% of those sales were returned, leading to a return volume of 428 billion. That's huge, and that's a growing number. Within that, there was a fraudulent return measurement of 5.9% of all returns were deemed as fraudulent or abusive, equating to about $25.3 billion of lost revenue due to these fraudulent returns. When we looked just at the online transactions or online sales from the NRF, the Census Bureau said about 14% of all of US retail sales were driven through online purchases. So that's about $565 billion. 18.1% of that was returned. So that's over $100 billion. So 1/4 of all returns are driven by only 14% of sales. So that's a dramatically large piece of the returns bucket. Also, there was 7.5% of all returns that were driven by online purchases were deemed as fraudulent or abusive returns. So that's a higher percentage for online purchases than the total returns. We also looked at who manages or owns returns within the retail organization. And we asked this numerous ways. In the pie chart on the left, you'll see we asked, does a single department or group own returns? And the majority was no. The split between in-store returns that are done in store or mailed-in returns were varied across many departments. In about 27% of retailers, the answer was yes, a single department owns it. But again, there's not one single department across many retailers. Merchandising, e-commerce, and loss prevention all played a role in that. And then in almost 30% who owned that return, the job function was unknown. In a separate survey, 97% of our retailers said no one executive or job function owns returns throughout their organization. So that's a possible miss on the consumer experience when doing a return if nobody is the owner of that. If we look at a bunch of facts that were compiled around returns from this annual survey and from other published surveys, we can see that what we'd reported on before, over 18% of items ordered online and returned in store are returned in store, whereas in brick and mortar stores, when they're purchased there, only 10.6% of those are returned. Year over year, online returns have more than doubled. So they're a major driver of the overall growth in returns. When we look at returns compared to sales for the average retailer, dividing it back into for every $1 billion in sales, there's over $100 million in returns. So that's again, a large volume of returns for that sales. When we look at returns from online shopping specifically, over 30% of online shoppers tell us that they overpurchase their online purchases and return items that are unwanted due to need or size or shopping considerations. 97% of consumers said they would buy again if the return process was easy. So that's a very positive for having a simple, easy return process. 68% of online shoppers look at return policies on the website before they make a purchase. And over 53%, or there could be a 53% increase in purchase desire, or otherwise stated as demand, if the consumer knows that they can easily return the item. So returns play a major factor, not just in consumer experience, but in purchases in general. When we look at return rate by retail category, the survey average for the NRF survey was 10.6%. But when we look at specific retail categories from Appriss retail clients, we see that return rates are spread across the board, everywhere from apparel and auto parts having very high return rates, higher than the industry average, to beauty and hard goods having lower return rates than the industry average. But Appriss Retail maintains this return rate summary. We call it a blended return rate for all of our customers. We also consider returns by the original payment type. And you can see that if something is bought originally on credit card, it has a much higher likelihood of being returned than if it was bought on cash or debit. The other category would be things like merchandise store credits and other forms of payment that are not as easily recorded in POS systems as cash, credit card, and debit cards are. So overall, returns are known to be a high-cost transaction. And we know from our survey that returns are growing. Returns are much more complex because they're involved with purchasing online and potentially returning in many different locations, including being mailed back or returned to the store. And because of this wider acceptance of returns or wider proliferation of returns, they're accepted almost everywhere, in the store, at the shipping site, and many other locations. Additionally, return is a lost sale, so cash profit and margin percentage are all reduced every time a return transaction happens. Returns also have labor costs because there's either an inspection of the product or restocking time. And during the pandemic, there were even more processes that happened with products that were returned if returns were allowed. Oftentimes, if a return is done after the season or after that product has been marketed, it could cause a markdown. It could cause an out of stock if someone has purchased a lot of items and the next shopper comes in to look for something and it's not there, but it will be returned later. Or there's also logistics expenses, and all those are increasing over time. And finally, returns cannot always be resold due to specifics with that item, specifics with the season, or specifics with the condition of the item as it's returned. When we look specifically at return fraud over the past year, we asked retailers which types of return fraud have they seen within the past year. And we do this every year since 2005, and the ones at the top of the list always show up year over year. So return of shoplifted or stolen merchandise, over half of all retailers have witnessed this within the past year. Return fraud that is done with an employee or with collusion with an outside person ranks high, as well as wardrobing or renting, which would be someone who buys an item, uses it, and returns it, whether it's a flat screen TV, a drill for a home improvement project, or an item of clothing. And then lastly, return of an item purchased with fraudulent or stolen tender. These four topics always list at the top, but there are many other issues that are related to return fraud that are reported on every year. So reducing returns can reduce shrink and loss. So when we look at best practices, we know that returns can be managed. How they're handled impacts customer perceptions. They're absolutely a time to reduce shrink, risk, and total loss. But each retailer and their customer base and merchandise mix are different. So the reason for returns may be different, but they can all be studied and managed. So that's best practice number one, is making sure you're managing and studying your returns and looking for ways to reduce shrink, risk, and loss. But even more importantly, returns offer great opportunities for customer experience. They're good. Your best shoppers often make the most returns. And that point of return is often a customer service moment of truth. A consumer has come into your store or has contacted you through your website, and wants to make a return. So they're a known customer, they're reaching out to you. This is the perfect time to engage with them and keep them shopping in your brand. If it's an in-store return, it's often a chance to meet and convert an online shopper who has brought that item to a physical store, and you have a chance to increase their experience and talk to them about other items in the store. Plus, returns overall are an opportunity to improve the consumer experience. Often they're an untapped touch point, so you can generate additional sales and profits incrementally with that consumer, either by getting them to purchase more or perhaps by incentivizing them to purchase more and recapture that lost sale, those dollars in your store or on your website before that consumer leaves. Finally, a Boston Consulting Group study reported in Women's Wear Daily about a year ago showed almost 40% of experts surveyed said allowing easy returns is the most important consumer need. So as returns are growing, and as you're concerned about return costs, using returns as a great opportunity to improve the consumer experience is really a definite effort of improvement that any retail chain can make and that can focus on generating additional incremental sales and profits. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching the webinar, and I'm happy to answer any questions.